Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for today's event. This event is part of our lecture series, Equitable Growth Presents, Evidence for a Stronger Economy, which fosters a deeper understanding of cutting-edge research on economic inequality and growth. These lectures bring together leading scholars and practitioners to explore how new research is shifting important conversations in academia and economic policy. I'm Lily Roberts, Vice President for Policy and Programs at Equitable Growth. For those of you who aren't familiar, Equitable Growth is an economic policy organization, connects economic evidence and policy to promote shared prosperity and growth. We do this by elevating scholars and their work within the policy world and translating evidence for policymakers. Founded in 2013, we aim to bridge the gap between policymakers and academics. Our event today is timely. The expansion of AI technologies and the clean energy transition are top of mind for policymakers and communities, and they're deeply intertwined, drawing on the same infrastructure, supply chains, and state capacity. Today's discussion will unpack the scale of the economic transformation that may be ahead of us and the choices that shape who will benefit from it. At Equitable Growth, we believe that governing during moments of rapid economic and technological change requires rigorous analysis and engagement across stakeholders, and we're here to do that today. Both AI and the clean energy transition are, at their core, stories about innovation. Dating back to Robert Solow's groundbreaking work, we know that durable economic growth is driven by innovation. However, when the benefits of innovation are concentrated, the ensuing inequality is a drag on growth and undermines trust in our governing institutions. At the same time, there's heated debate about which specific policies and policy frameworks will most effectively deliver necessary investments, infrastructure, and good jobs. Earlier this year, the World Bank, champion of the Washington Consensus, released a report acknowledging that well-designed industrial policy can drive meaningful economic development, while proponents of the abundance agenda argue that too much government intervention in markets is impeding large-scale projects. As policymakers seek to expand energy capacity and promote technological innovation, and workers and communities advocate for a seat at the table, an important question remains. Which policy approaches are most likely to deliver the scale, speed, and equitable outcomes that this moment requires? We're fortunate to have a distinguished group of experts with experience both in the academy and the federal government to work through these policy challenges. Our conversation will begin with a presentation and will be followed by a panel conversation before audience Q&A. Our presenter today is Costa Samaras. A leading researcher on the energy transition and AI expansion, Costa is the director of the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation and trustee professor of civil and environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. From 2021 to 2024, he served in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the Principal Assistant Director of Energy. The moderator for our panel is Samira Fazeli. Samira is a member of Equitable Growth's Board of Directors, and she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of the White House National Economic Council, where she led the Biden-Harris administration's work on industrial policy, supply chains, and regional economic development, and the administration's response to numerous supply chain crises. She also played a leading role in the passage and implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. With that, I'll turn things over to Costa to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you to Sanjay and Chantil and the team at Equitable Growth. I'm delighted to be here with you to kick off this conversation with a short presentation around why I think we need a grid new deal in the age of AI, energy, and climate. So AI is amplifying the existing uncertainties around climate, around energy, and society. And some of these uncertainties deal with, how cheap technologies are going to get, or what types of systems should we be designing for future climate extremes. But really, the deepest uncertainties are how AI and climate, together and separately, affect affordability, society, and our overall outcomes. Our existing energy system and the entire supply chain already have exposure to vulnerabilities around multiple climate threats. from wildfires to increased extreme precipitation events to droughts. All of these affect not only how we get energy, but also how we use energy. And this is a problem because electricity is the economic infrastructure for this entire century. And it also happens to be the foundational layer to enable the growth of artificial intelligence. And so we have an aging grid that's vulnerable to current and future climate extremes. We have electricity prices rising faster than inflation. And we have a near-term spike in demand from AI data centers that are driving near-term electricity growth. But we're going to be living with how we handle this moment for the next several decades. And so AI has this potential to improve affordability, to improve climate outcomes, to improve innovation. But I want to stress this will not happen on its own. It needs to have smart policy, shared governance for shared prosperity. So in the United States, for the last 2 decades, we haven't had a lot of electricity growth. But for data centers, this is all US electricity for data centers in the United States. We only had a small increase in the amount of electricity data centers we're using in the last decade, while internet traffic grew by a lot. And this is because data centers got more efficient and because they introduced some additional technologies to increase the amount of compute you could get for the amount of energy that you put in. Now, somewhere along 2020, 2021, as both AI models got more powerful as you make them bigger and how they got more attractive for use across different parts of the economy, those efficiency trends started to break. And now all data centers in the United States consume about 4 or 5% of US electricity demand. Now, going forward, data centers could be 9 to 17% or more of US electricity by the end of the decade. And there's a wide range of uncertainty on this. But what's important is we need a plan, both at the local level, at the state level, and the national level, to understand how we deal with the growth in demand from AI, as well as how we deal with the growth of demand from broader electrification. More than 61% of Americans already said that utility bills are adding to their financial stress. Uh, Electricity rates are rising faster than inflation, and that is because, one, the growth in new demands from different parts of the economy, but two, because our grid is old and it's under stress from existing threats, we're rebuilding some of that in place, and that's being passed on to customers. In addition, well, you can think of a data center like a giant steel mill or an aluminum foundry, a big amount of electricity demand that can show up quickly. And this speed is causing challenges in local communities. It also causes challenges when there's lots of fossil fuel that is burned on site, and in some areas where there's areas of water stress. But here's the problem. Data centers, while growing rapidly now, only represent about half of the amount of electricity demand that we might see going forward from things like electrifying our homes and vehicles, or electrifying factories, or electrifying commercial buildings. And so if we can't get the data center part right now, we will be unable to meet our climate objectives going forward in the future. So AI and the energy transition are intertwined. We already see a growing national popular support for a data center moratorium, and policymakers are responding. In the background of all this, the energy transition and addressing climate change is going to require a lot of new clean electricity. It's going to require a doubling of the grid or potentially more, and it's going to require a lot more use of the existing grid in smarter ways. So we need to ask ourselves in this moment, what do we want the future to look like? In the last century, the growth of the highway system produced profound changes in the American economy, some good, but some bad, and concentrated pollution in new areas. Earlier, the United States from the 1930s to the 1950s electrified more than 90% of US farms that didn't have access to electricity through a concerted effort of public, local, and private actors. And in that moment showed that the United States could get big things done across a shared national mission. So it's time for another type of shared national mission for electrification. Because the electric grid is the foundation for 21st century prosperity, we need the people to build the public capacity to deliver electrification. We need policy that are going to align the rules for the outcomes that we want. And we need investment across public and private sources to actually go and build a doubling or more of the grid. In public capacity, we could need things like an American Grid Corps that staff the public utility commissions and other local organizations that make decisions of hundreds of billions of dollars per year on behalf of communities. We also will need a lot more line workers, electricians, and other skilled trades. And we'll need community capacity to enable earned speed with local community benefits and buy-in. So we'll also need public policy. Earlier, we had a rural electrification administration. We might be thinking about now an administration that rapidly co-plans and permits generation, transmission, and demand together. We also need to think about cost allocation for shared growth and prosperity as data centers are showing up in communities. And we need to have a much smarter, much more flexible, and much more sustainable interaction between electrification and communities so that the social license grows and not contracts. And all of this requires investment. And we need shared public and private investment to treat the grid like a national asset. The U.S. highway system has a highway trust fund. We should be considering a national grid trust fund. This could be loan guarantees, shared reinvestment for both clean power and resilience, because a lot of the challenges that we're seeing with affordability now are because our transmission and distribution system are under threat from extreme weather and climate extremes. And we should be rebuilding those for the weather of this century, not the weather of last century. We also have the opportunity to do federal market shaping. And this, by having the federal government be a large procurer and a standardizer of things like pole-mounted transformers and grid products and other equipment that we're going to need to be growing at a very rapid pace, this enables lower cost and faster procurement. And then finally, this is a moment where we think about public and private and philanthropic community benefit. Data centers want to get online quickly. We should be thinking at the state level, what are opportunities to help communities have more affordable, more resilient, more cleaner power in this moment? And align public, private, and philanthropic capital, delivering not just the connection of a data center, but the long-term affordable and clean provision of power and beyond in communities. So under deep uncertainty, we always advise policymakers to say, if you don't know what the future looks like, we should be doing taking actions now that we would not regret later. And in this moment, when we know we need a stronger, more resilient, a cleaner, more affordable and reliable electricity system, we should be leaning in to delivering that type of system and infrastructure now as a economic legacy for affordability and shared prosperity for the rest of the century. Because AI and energy don't just stop at the data center. The way that AI and energy intertwine with electricity extend to the transportation system and the industrial system and our building system and agricultural system. And we need to be shaping the ways that AI and digitization and broader electrification interact with those sectors to shape positive climate outcomes and positive innovation outcomes. So I'll end here on this slide in that my colleagues in the White House put out an AI Bill of Rights to understand how the society should be participating in making sure that in the age of AI, that human outcomes were good. So I'll add to that AI Bill of Rights a climate and energy amendment in this moment, in that we need to make state, local, and federal policy, as well as interact in philanthropic and private and other public spaces, to make sure that in this moment, we're not just thinking about the short term, we're thinking about the long term. and that we're building a national shared infrastructure that is going to enable uh, our climate, environmental, and innovation outcomes across a range of activity. And I think with today's panel, we're looking forward to a robust discussion about what's needed, what should society demand, and what are the opportunities for innovation and research in this time of deep uncertainty. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Samira.
Thank you, Costa, for that wonderful presentation. I'm really excited to moderate this panel discussion. This panel will last about 20 or 25 minutes. Before I introduce my panelists, I want to make sure that all participants know that you can send Q&A by submitting your questions through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll save the last 10 minutes for taking that Q&A. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. First, we have Heather Boucher. She is a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania's Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors and chief economist to President Biden's Invest in America cabinet. We have Jigar Shah, who is the co-managing partner at Multiplier and the former director of the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, where he oversaw over $108 billion in federal investments. And he was named in 2024 as one of Time 100's most influential people in the world. We have Neil Thompson, who is the director of the Future Tech Research Project and is cross-appointed at MIT's Computer Science and AI Lab, as well as at MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. So we have people with deep expertise on AI, on electricity, and on economics with us today. Let me begin with a question for you, Heather. As Costa kind of laid out for us just now, AI expansion and the energy transition are both taking claims on scarce economic and human resources. Costa really talked about how the grid is foundational, but AI is too, right? Both are general purpose technologies and operate like infrastructure, therefore, in our society. So before we talk about how we should manage those demands that AI expansion and the energy transition are placing on society, what do you think society should be demanding in return and why? How can we think about that, Heather?
Oh, it's such a great question. First of all, it was a delight to listen to Costa. I thought that was such a great presentation. I will just note doing a presentation on Zoom is so hard and you got it right. So just kudos. One thing that I wrote down from your remarks that I think is a nice starting place of an answer to what Samir asked is that, quote, we are going to be living with how we handle this moment. And I think it's so important to start there. When I think about the US economy, I often think about the fact that, and we've seen now a half century of rising economic inequality. We've seen policies out of Washington that have not focused on making the investments in people and places all across the country and have not made the investments in the productive capacity that we need to see in the industries that matter. I think as and Samira probably is the one on the call that knows this better than any of us. When we entered the White House in 2021, the biggest crisis in front of us was the semiconductor shortage, which was the result of decades of inaction and a failure to think about the kinds of questions that Costa was putting on the table for a new technology. So I would encourage us to take that sentence that he said to heart as we're thinking about the economic implications. What we make in this country and how we make it is so important. And artificial intelligence is important for being on the cutting edge of the technologies that are important for the future. It's going to be important for, and I'm hoping Jigger and other folks more knowledgeable than me about the energy systems can talk about this, what it means for using energy efficiently and hooking up different grid parts. It's a really important technological tool. But there are a couple of really big challenges that we need to start off by getting them right. And so one is we do need to have a national conversation about who owns this technology and who's benefiting from it. There aren't any competition experts on this call, so I'll impersonate one. But this is a field where a small number of firms are getting that first mover advantage, and we want to see that technology move forward, the innovation, all of that. But we do need to have a conversation about who's gaining from this economic growth. They are using all of the data that humans have put on the internet or made available for all of time, and people haven't been paid for that. What does that mean? What do we think about that as a society? And then a second issue that Costa brought up is how do we think about the trade-offs? We are in this moment when we need to expand capacity and build new energy systems, ideally clean energy systems for our economy writ large. But if this one sector that has this seemingly, it feels like infinite amount of money right now, is able to co-opt that expansion for itself, what does that mean for all of the other industries that, quite frankly, also matter? So we have to be thinking deeply about those trade-offs and what we as a society want. So I think it is about how the production of this technology affects the distribution of the gains in the first instance, and how we're thinking about those trade-offs across different industries and what we truly think is important for our economic future. I will end there and pass the baton back over to you, Samira.
All right, thanks for laying that all out. I think we're going to have a rich discussion now about just what you said, who's going to win, who's going to lose in both the AI transition and the energy transition. And I really love what you said about how do we think about who stands to gain in industry, because there could be some real concentrated benefits even between different industries in this. Casa, let's do this panel with really bringing together your frame around a Green New Deal, and I think I'll frame a lot of these questions around your people, policy, and investment frame. So let me start with bringing Neil and Jigger together into this conversation, and so we can talk about what policymakers need to know and what questions they should be asking, and how we get the infrastructure side of Costa's Green New Deal right, the people, policy, and investment. What do you think policymakers need to know? Neil, let me start with you. You're an AI researcher. What can you tell us about the forecasts about future compute efficiency and electricity demand? A lot is still emerging, a lot is still changing in this industry. And based on what you know, on what evidence we have available today, what forecasts are out there, what's actually reliable information, what should policymakers understand about the forces shaping that demand? That might be model development, efficiency improvements, the diffusion of the technology into the workplace. Well, let me turn it to you, Neil.
Yeah, so this is such an important question, and it's a challenging one because we're all trying to project forward and say, well, if trends continue and these things, what will the energy demand look like? But of course, under the hood, this is hard because there are some very, very deep and fast-moving forces that are shaping it. And if one of those forces ends up dominating, that could determine the overall effect. So let me unpack that a little bit for us. So when we think about the energy demand, I think there's two things that are really pushing it to be a lot higher. So one of that is just more and more adoption, right? We see more and more firms doing that. We may have this sense that AI is already everywhere, but if you actually look within firms or across firms, the number of firms that are using AI and the sort of the extent that they're using it is still pretty limited. We have a lot of expansion left to go in terms of adoption. And so we're sort of very early in that curve of how much people are using it. We're going to see a lot of expansion and demand coming from that. The second thing that matters is the actual model that people are using, because it turns out that predominantly the way we have gotten better models over the last 10 years is by making these models bigger. By bigger here means like more model parameters, but in sort of the practical version of that is it means that you have to use more GPUs for more time, and that means more electricity. Okay, so we have many more people adopting, and the models they're using are getting bigger. And this is not getting bigger by like a factor of 30%. This is by something like a factor of 3x per year. So these are very, very big changes that are happening on the positive side. Now, of course, you might imagine that would dominate, but there actually are other countervailing effects that are also happening pretty quickly here. So one is hardware efficiency. So NVIDIA and others are working very hard to say, how can we be more efficient in these things? If you actually look over the past decade, what you find is that the improvement in the number of operations that you can get per watt of power that you put in is going up by something like 60 to 70% per year. This is a very, very fast efficiency improvement, meaning that, something that you said, oh, well, this particular task took a lot of power like last year, might actually not take that much this year because you can just put it onto new hardware that is much more efficient. The other thing, and I think this is often overlooked, is algorithmic efficiency. So what is algorithmic efficiency? Well, it says, look, if I give you the same GPU in both these periods, the same amount of computing power, the same amount of power that's actually being used, can you harness that to actually produce more? And it turns out the answer is yes. So the same size of model, the same power that we used a year ago, turns out to, like, a year later, we can actually do much, much better. We can have models that perform much, much better on it. And again, that's a very, very fast impact that's going on. And so even faster than the hardware change. So what that means is that we have, on one hand, incredible expansion in demand and incredible push towards bigger models. On the other hand, we have, at any particular level of capacity, the hardware and the algorithms are making the cost of running that go down very fast. And so we have this race between these two factors. And the problem is, of course, that they're all moving so fast, so much faster than we can adapt the energy system, that it's sort of a challenge to think about which of those is going to dominate, particularly because these are going to change over time. If we think about, for example, hardware, we know that the evolution of this chip technology has depended on things like miniaturization and other things that we may not have that much time left on. And so there may be slowing in some of these trends, which could affect a lot of what's going to happen in even sort of 3 to 5 years.
That's great. Do you want to say a bit about its diffusion into actually being used? So you spoke a lot about model development itself, but anything you want to add about, this isn't just about models being developed in the ether, it's models being developed and then used and applied. Any way we should factor that into this question of the demand it's placing on the grid?
Yeah, so this is,
and also how quickly, both the demand on the grid and how quickly we need to meet that demand so that AI can be diffusing into society as rapidly as it needs to.
Yeah, so I would say, in terms of the actual adoption of these tools, it's interesting because it's already the case today that if you ask people, 60-80% of the people will say like, oh, I used AI within the last week or the last month, to do something. So it's sort of people are experimenting with it. They're sort of seeing it in some parts of their work. But if you actually look at deep adoption, my lab has done some work on that. You see that only about 10% of firms have it sort of deeply embedded in the things they're doing, but another 10% of firms are sort of have it in some measure of production. They're starting to see some benefits, but it's still pretty limited. So there's lots of scope, first of all, for more firms to adopt. But there's also scope for, even with these firms that are doing it, for them to adopt it a lot more. They may say, here are 2 or 3 sort of pilot areas that we're doing a lot of work in, we see gains. But of course, as across society, we develop more tools and more capabilities, we're going to do this much more broadly. And so, we have many, many orders of magnitude of increased demand that we're likely to see from this greater adoption. And of course, that will, if the efficiency gains don't keep up, that will be additional burden that the grid has to meet.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And of course, the financial press has had a ton of stories lately on how CFOs are also balking at the cost of diffusion right now in their industries and whether the gains they're seeing enough gains from all that cost. Jigger, let me bring you in now to talk more about the bottlenecks that have emerged and that are proving difficult to resolve in regards to helping AI get the energy infrastructure that it needs. You have been a leader in both business and government on the energy transition. And so Costa's Grid New Deal is pretty similar to a lot of the alignment you've always tried to do between people, policy, and investment. Do you think existing policy is working to attract the investment we need for the AI transition and the energy transition, or to even align the AI and the energy transitions with one another? Why or why not? And I'll be provocative for a second, and I'll say I ask that because in some ways, AI could lock in a fossil-powered grid for another few decades and actually prove to be a headwind to the overall energy transition. Although I'm sure you're going to prove me wrong on that fear. Go ahead, Jigger.
Thanks for the question. And as always, Costa's got a fantastic presentation, which I learned a lot from. I think You ask about policy. I think we start by saying that we operate under existing policy, right? So the Federal Power Act from 1935, PURPA, and other, sort of pieces of legislation that have been passed. None of us feel confident that we can remake the policy infrastructure by which we're governed, right? It is a very high lift, and there are a lot of incumbent players, right? And so what the federal government has done in the past is use cash to be able to get people to move faster. So I think the first question you've asked is the existing policy working? I mean, I think the answer is obviously not. People are spending a lot of time. But one of the things I would say we should focus on first is getting the data right, which Neil, I think, indicated. There are a lot of conversations about 1 gigawatt plus data centers. The vast majority of data centers being built today are 100 megawatts, not 1 gigawatt plus, right? And so there is this need constantly for people to talk about Mr. Wonderful on TV at 9.3 gigawatts or whatever it is in Utah. But when you think about what's really happening, we're using AI already through Grid Care and Grid Astra and Camu Energy and Think Lab and Google Tapestry to find pockets of capacity that nobody knew was there, right? So just this week, they announced that Grid Care found 650 megawatts of capacity in National Grid New York's territory that they forgot was there. So, when you look at Tyler Norris's paper, there's who's now at Google but was at Duke University, there's about 100,000 megawatts of this capacity that will be found by AI just by like reviewing utility data and using the grid that we've already paid for more efficiently. Now, some of that will require a little bit of battery storage to be added or a little bit of backup generation or other things. But when you think about how much you could add to the existing grid without a lot of incremental new investment, that would dramatically reduce bills. So Grid Care just came out with a paper showing that for every 1,000 megawatts that we accommodate within the grid using these tools, you would drop people's electricity bills by 5%, right? And so in that region. And so I think that those tools are important, and those tools are so cheap that the US Department of Energy could pay for all of them. So for like $50 million, they could map out the entire grid for the entire country, right? But the leadership isn't there to do it, but it could happen. Once you actually then map out the grid, then you do have existing tools and policy that we can use to help solve it. So for instance, the Loan Programs Office has a program called the 1706 program, which is the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, which of course has been renamed the Energy Dominance Program as usual. And that program has been used to provide the largest loan ever to Georgia Power to upgrade their transmission system so that they can accommodate more load growth from AI data centers, et cetera. And that interest rate is at about 80 basis points less than they would normally pay. Georgia Power estimates that by taking that loan, they will save $7 billion of interest payments for ratepayers across their territory. There's $250 billion that was allocated within the EIR program, and something on the order of 50 billion of it's been allocated. So there's another $200 billion there, right? And then I think that once you use up all of these tools that we've discussed, and there's another $1.5 billion, I think, or so of grants that are repurposed from the Grid Deployment Office, which I think is now called Spark. And that money can be used to provide rebates for dynamic line ratings and advanced conductors and that kind of stuff. Then I do think that we all need to acknowledge why the Federal Highway Program works, right? And it's because the federal government pays for 90% and the states only pay for 10%. And that, I think, is ultimately where this will go, is once we map out the entire grid and figure out how much we need to double the grid's capacity. To Costa's point, it's not just AI, but it's also electric vehicles and new manufacturing and all sorts of other things. Then I think that that last remaining bit probably will take some sort of additional policy where the federal government plays a bigger role, but in exchange actually pays for a bigger percentage of the bill.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about this. Sounds like we have a lot of existing policy tools that could be used and repurposed, you're saying. It takes a little bit of
Yeah.
planning. It's not that costly. Was it 50 million? in some planning dollars could then leverage some existing federal programs. So we've kind of solved some of Costa's investment challenge, some of his policy challenge, but I think we really need to zero in now on like both people and the distributional impacts of these investments. So before I turn to my next set of questions, I'm going to remind our listeners that they can submit questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All questions must be submitted there because that's where we're going to pull questions for the last 10 minutes of Q&A here. All right, let's bring people to the conversation, what society might be demanding from the grid and from AI. Heather, I think you said this already, but people are consumers, they are workers, they are members of local communities. There are going to be different effects on different industries. So, Neil and Costa, let me start here with you and ask what are the ultimate. Oh, before I actually ask that question, sorry, one reminder to folks who are submitting questions, please include your name and affiliation when you submit a question, because I need to read those when I ask your question. So Neil and Costa, what are the ultimate, help us start unpacking the costs and benefits here. What are some of the costs of grid expansion and the AI build out? Who should be paying for these costs? What principles should guide how these costs are allocated? Who are lined up right now to receive those benefits if the markets are just allowed to proceed as they're moving right now? Kind of absent government intervention, how should we think about the distribution of costs and benefits here? And the reason I'm asking that is because obviously how those costs and benefits are going to be allocated absent government design usually impacts how government thinks about what its interventions should be in the first place. Costa, do you want to kick us off there? Because you started talking about water and pollution and other impacts to think about here.
Sure. And I agree with all the comments of our great panel so far. The AI data center construction boom is driving a lot of investment. It's driving growth in the trades. It's driving growth in labor, and that was on the positive side of the ledger, and then on the negative side, because many of these medium and larger size data centers are not able to connect to the grid, or there's not enough opportunity to connect to cleaner power. We're seeing a lot of natural gas being used, or other fossil generators ramp up production. And so what's happening is the communities that are around those plants, the communities that are near the data centers, they are getting increased pollution. And so there are not broadly shared benefits in this build out. And when that happens, we start to see some of the backlash that we're seeing. And I think we need to be proactive in our policymaking at all levels of government to ensure that everyone has a stake in an electrified future. Because otherwise, we will continue to have this piecemeal wildcat type of investment that ultimately will not be cleaner, will not be cheaper, it will not be faster. And it just happens to be the kind of the paths of least resistance in different parts of the country. So I think it starts with, can we build infrastructure that has community buy-in and that is fast, clean, and affordable? I think that we can. We can use a lot of the policies and mechanisms that Jigger has outlined. And I really want to stress, like, absent any other coordinated effort, we won't get the outcomes that we want. We will trend towards a more fossil heavy and more expensive grid.
And I think you use the phrase earned speed in your presentation to talk about really having more management around the distributional impacts or those kind of negative externalities that some communities are facing over others. Is that what you meant by earned speed?
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote a policy piece last year on smart grid AI or smart AI fast lanes. It basically says, if you want to go fast, go together and show up with investment, not just for clean power for yourself, but clean power and infrastructure and other community infrastructure and benefits, so that those types of things don't roll onto people's bills, going forward. So the opportunity for states and communities to say, yes, let's build something together that works for everybody and enable that as the fast lane is an opportunity that we're not really taking advantage of right now.
Great. Neil, do you want to offer any thoughts on the AI piece of that, AI costs and benefits of that transition?
Yeah, and maybe I'll sort of focus on the benefits piece in particular, right? Because I think there's a lot of question about, well, okay, if we're paying all of this for the AI side, well, who's going to benefit and how big are those benefits going to be? And it's actually pretty interesting that at least so far, what we've had is this pretty measured gains. So, for example, IBM did an estimate where they said that the return on investment that AI developers were getting when they deploy it, even when it scales, they were getting something like a 7% return, and that is really, pretty marginal against what most firms are actually investing. So that you're not sort of immediately saying like, oh, we're going to get these really very large benefits. But I think there are two things that are really important to highlight here. So one is that if you actually unpack why you're getting these sort of marginal benefits, what you see is that two things are going on at the same time. So one is that in some parts of what we're doing, we are getting benefits that are substantially larger, but we're also coming up with new costs that come with doing these things. So this can be, as simple as like you're deploying an AI system and you just have to make sure that now, because it's a little flawed and something like that, that you're not introducing sort of bad content into the world or things like that. But of course, this can be a lot richer than that as well. What of course is going to happen over time is that we're going to figure out ways to mitigate some of those bad effects. And so we are going to start to see bigger, large effects that are going to come in, bigger productivity effects that are going to come in. And so I think we're going to see that. I think that in a lot of cases, it's going to be pretty broad. We see that in some of the work that my lab has done, we've looked at, well, which occupations, which tasks are exposed to AI and where you can start to see automation or augmentation of what the workers themselves are doing. And we see that there's actually a pretty broad effect that they're able to do. That suggests that lots and lots of people are going to get these gains. Of course, that means that we're going to need to figure out a way to pay for these things, either directly or for folks. The other thing I want to highlight here as a game, which I think maybe people will overlook, is that there is a pathway where AI is accelerating science, right? And we sort of hinted at this in terms of what effect it can have on the grid itself, but even more generally, what we see is that scientists are much better able to leverage what a computer can do when they're able to use AI. And that means that there's going to have a substantial acceleration of economic growth. That could make the pie bigger, which will help us pay for these kind of things.
Yeah. So like the kind of discover gains. Okay, Heather, we're bringing you back in. Don't worry. I can see you there. I want to bring Heather and Jigger in here now. Because Costa, you said this has to be managed so that the benefits and costs can be more equally shared and equitably shared across society. So Heather and Jigger, AI is sparking a lot of debate on what steps policymakers can take to make sure the gains from AI are more broadly distributed and more equitably shared in society. Both of you were policymakers in the Biden administration with me, and you tested a lot of ideas in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in the Inflation Reduction Act, and in the CHIPS and Science Act on how infrastructure and industrial policy investments can be designed to deliver equitable economic outcomes. Now we have a whole new set of policies being debated with AI, like taxes, royalties, public ownership, equity stakes, sovereign wealth funds, things we talked a little bit about quietly in the Biden years, but no one was going to go public with moving those forward. And now suddenly they're talked about in the mainstream in DC. How should we evaluate these different approaches, since some are tested and some are less tested, and their ability to ensure the gains from AI are more broadly distributed for people and communities? Heather, let me start with you because you've been so patient.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has just been such a great conversation. A couple of things that I want to get into the conversation, though. So, I think all of us on this call know Bettany Jones, who served in the Department of Energy, and she just did a new report with someone named Joe Peck on, I think it's called, like, the word receipts is in the title. But looking at the community benefits agreements, the community benefits plans that the Department of Energy required or asked firms to do. And one of the things that really struck me from looking at that paper was how many firms said that doing something like that, working with the community on the front end, actually made things go faster and smoother, and that wasn't the hurdle, like making sure that you do right by the community or thinking about workers wasn't the biggest problem, which I think actually gets to some of the abundance critique, like where are the challenges to building big? so often I think there's this knee, I mean, I say this as somebody who's thought about labor over a lot of my career. There's this knee jerk, oh, it's obviously workers or wages. That's the problem. I think we don't actually have a lot of evidence pointing to that being the real binding constraint. Communities want an economic development agenda. They want the kind of energy that's going to serve their communities and is going to create the opportunity for industry to thrive so they can have those good jobs. But they also want that partnership. And there was a lot of different tactics and tools that we used over the Biden years to do that. So it wasn't just one thing, it was a variety of different ways that we were encouraging the businesses that received government support to do good by the workers that they were going to hire and the communities that they were going to be located in. Um, and to just pre-butt the critique that I feel like we got 1,000 times on that, or more, every time you're opening a new facility, you're making these decisions. There are people as a part of that firm that are making decisions around HR, that are making decisions around siting, that are making decisions that are going to affect the community. And what we tried to do was to nudge all of those decisions in ways that would mean that the gains of growth would be broadly shared and then it would be beneficial to communities. So I think, and I point to Bettany's paper as just one of many, but one that came out in the past few weeks from the Roosevelt Institute that makes that case. It says, hey, here's something we did and it worked. Um, and I will say that, again, when you look back over the last 50 years of American history, Neil's point that making a bigger pie is the goal. That's a really important goal. That's a necessary condition for growth to happen. The pie's got to grow. That's necessary, but that is not sufficient for that growth to be shared. And that's what we've seen time and time and time again. And we know from prior technological transitions, prior policy transitions, that other countries have dealt with this a lot better, that the gains of growth have been shared, and a lot of those lessons we took into our agenda. But I think that point that we want the pie to be bigger, we're not trying to stop that, but we do need to keep pushing on all these ways to share those gains, feels to me like something that needs to be our North Star for how we're thinking about these questions.
Jigger, your response, and then I'm going to pull us into a lightning closing round so we can move quickly to the Q&A. Jigger?
Well, just to answer your question on the sovereign wealth fund and all the other craziness. I mean, one of the things I would say is that basically, as a private sector person, I have no idea what they're doing, right? And so it feels just completely and utterly random. And what ends up happening is, particularly in the critical mineral space, is when you take a position in, let's say, MP Materials or some of the other companies, it then sends a signal to all of their potential competitors that the US government has chosen a winner and that none of the other companies are going to get a fair shot at getting contracts or offtake agreements or other things. And so it's actually chilled investment in the critical mineral space more than it's helped. And so I think it's important to make sure that when you shape these kinds of ideas, that they're actually formulaic and that there's some sort of transparent way that they're applied. So it could be, these are the risks that the US government's taking that it cannot solve for in any other way. And so therefore it has to take equity or whatever it is, right? And so I think that framework seems lacking today, and I think will be needed in the future if it's going to be useful.
All right. Well, if each of you could take 30 seconds and answer this question before I turn to the Q&A. A lot of our audience today is researchers, since equitable growth does so much bridging between academics and policymakers. Where do researchers still lack the data analytical tools or frameworks needed to evaluate all these trade-offs we've discussed? And what research would you find most valuable to deliver to policymakers over the next few years? I don't know if maybe we start with Heather on that one.
Oh, what a tough question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I have been curious about is knowing more about the trade-offs that communities and public local utilities are having to make between different needs. Many of the things that Costa said, and I'm not familiar with whether or not there's enough data on that, but that is certainly a question that has come up time and again in the conversations I've been having.
Okay, Costa?
I think to Neil and Jigger's point, we need demonstrated use cases that AI has enabled big gains in science and in energy and in broader climate outcomes, because I do believe that those are possible. We need to actually show that this is what's happened. Here's kick the tires. Here's the real numbers, and that's a broader opportunity to do data sharing between industry, the states, and the government to enable a set of who wins, who loses, and who's paying the price and who's gaining the benefits.
Neil?
So for me, I think the thing that would be really valuable here is better information on how fast adoption is happening and where. So, like I mentioned that there are these big changes in efficiency, big differences in usage, but what people like my lab are able to do is look at that as sort of an aggregate. It's incredibly important that we ultimately can look at within, so say the data that OpenAI or Anthropic or something has and say, here's how these models are evolving, here's what this is going to mean for like the efficiency in which occupations, and therefore, because you have to go all the way down to that final level of granularity to be able to make predictions about the grid.
All right, and Jigger, you want to close this out so we can move to the Q&A quickly? Sorry, I'm keeping
Sure. No worries. I think there's a huge trust gap today, and I think a lot of the polling shows that from Pew and others. And I think that the research community can help manage that. So, for instance, like why did we have a 45% rate increase from investor-owned utilities since 2020 and no perceptible rate increase above inflation from large public power entities like LATWP or CPS or Austin Energy, et cetera, right? The question is like, why are we constantly talking about 9.3 gigawatt data centers when everybody that has looked at all this data shows that 90% of all of the AI compute's going to be inference in 2030, and inference can be 100 megawatt and smaller formats, right? What is the truth? What is not the truth, right? It just feels like with $1 trillion industry, we should have better data and not just bigger is better, because bigger is quite expensive and quite detrimental to our grid.
Well, that's a perfect tee up to the first question. Jeff St. John, who's a reporter at Canary Media, asks, where do we see state regulators applying critical analysis and due diligence to not yet built AI data centers, putting requirements on developers to meet certain milestones before their load growth or energy demand claims become part of resource planning? And what are the reasonable and prudent approaches you would suggest on that front? I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe Costa and Jigger.
Sure. I mean, I can start. I think, in general, I think this notion that the regulators are going to be smart enough to actually have an engaged conversation with data centers on a real-time basis, I think is unreasonable, and the resourcing isn't there. I think when you look at Texas and what they've done, which I think is really the lighthouse, I think, for everyone to follow, they've just said this is what it looks like to be a good corporate citizen, right? Like we will put you on an interruptible tariff. You will actually be the first one to be browned down, right? Like reduce your consumption if there's a problem in the grid, and we will give you a certain allocation, right? And then if you want to use more than that allocation, then you have to put in behind the meter batteries. You have to like figure out virtual power plants. You have to figure out, all these other things. And so I think that there just needs to be as best practices. Here's what it looks like for you to be a good grid citizen, as opposed to let's go back and forth for like, 20 rounds, which I don't think the regulators have the resources to do.
And the examples of being a good citizen was brownouts, and what are some other top things? Because Jeff had a
Well,
follow-up question
the number one,
on that.
yeah, the number one thing everyone should do nationwide right now is put everyone on an interruptible tariff. We did that in the steel industry, aluminum industry. Like, I mean, this has been around for years. If we just forgot to do it the last 10 years. And so we just need to reinstitute that and say, you're on an interruptible tariff. Now, when we interrupt you, because there's a challenge on the grid, now what are our preferred ways for you to deal with that interruption, right? There's the Emerald AI approach, which is like, shifting compute. There's building behind the meter natural gas plants, probably not our preferred approach. There's putting in batteries strategically on the circuit to be able to shift load. There's lots of things that you can do, and a lot of the AI tools can help you guide them. But the very first thing you do is to force everyone onto an interruptible tariff, because that's how they become a good grid citizen. And then there's a number of different ways to mitigate the impacts on the data center and their business plans.
That dynamic smart grid we all want. Costa, do you want to answer this, or do you want me to go to the next question?
I'll just say quickly, this is the people part of the Grid New Deal part of the presentation that I laid out, which is our state institutions, our public utility commissions are not built for this. They don't have enough staff, they don't have enough funding, they don't have enough expertise to be rapid, innovative, and broadly look out for communities. They're doing a great job and doing their best, but there'd be more people, more expertise, and there's an opportunity to build those types of institutions for the type of load growth that we need.
Yeah, it's a real David versus Goliath. It feels like at the state level in terms of these tiny regulators and these massive industries that they're regulating. Dominique Rowinsky from Columbia University at SEPA asks, can you address the recent graduates, both undergraduate and graduate, who want to work in this space? Where should we look to make an impact and move the energy transition forward through the AI rollout? Anyone want to take that?
Well, let me just, this is going to be a slightly different angle on your question. And maybe, I mean, I know Costa talked about this a little bit, but, he did bring up this one point that I think it's really important to keep emphasizing is that we are going to need a lot of production workers. And how we think about that, how we prepare for that, how we train people is really important. But one of the challenges over recent decades has been that those kinds of jobs haven't provided long-term economic security, which creates huge disincentives to invest in those skills. So how are we rethinking those career trajectories and the pipeline of not just how we're training people, but how we're making sure that that's going to be a career you can have 10, 20, 30 years down the road? I think that's a question that for policymakers and for local actors to be thinking about, but is a part of the answer to this. So there's college grads, and then there's folks that might be looking for more the apprenticeship or production model.
Mm-hmm. And so anyone else on moving the energy transition forward to the AI rollout for students who are about to graduate?
Well, I mean, I would say that,
go work for Jigger. I'm kidding.
I have a lot of companies that are definitely hiring, so happy to have graduating. I think a couple of big themes. I'd say one is people who do construction management go to college. And so we have a lack of EPC contractors and EPC, professionals in our country. And so
EPC means?
engineering, procurement, construction, firms. And so, go work for one. Once you get enough experience, leave and go start your own. We need more firms. And so, a lot of opportunity there. Second is there's, to Costa's point, a ton of public capacity that needs to be built. And so go join a public service commission. All of them are hiring. Go to the governor's offices. Everyone suddenly wants to be smart on energy. Go to a lot of these places and they want to do that. And then the third is that there is now a flourishing of clean energy companies, many of which existed 10 years ago, who pivoted towards AI-based solutions. Enchanted Rock, our friends there, just went public today on the stock exchange, and they're all hiring because they all need these fresh-faced college grads to figure out how to make their way in the world and help build their businesses.
Well, let me try to move this to one more question, if that's okay, because we're of time. Vijay Prakash, who's an econ PhD at the University of Delaware, asked, what role can a fuel cell play to mitigate the scarcity of electricity in the short and long term for data centers? Costa, I don't know if you feel like that's one you can take.
So a fuel cell uses primarily natural gas. It could use other fuels to convert that fuel into electricity and heat that can be used on site. And so you were seeing a growth of a lot of these in areas where you want to have real-time backup electricity, but don't have direct, at least air emissions. Now, that still creates CO2 emissions. So we have to be creative about the types of technologies that we'll need for firm, reliable power, both in data centers and beyond. And so we really have to have not just a near-term innovation agenda, but a long-term innovation agenda to deploy lots of new geothermal and getting new nuclear fission on schedule and deploying and working on new fusion stuff. So I think that we shouldn't ever take our foot off of the innovation pedal as much as we are absolutely need to be deploying lots of solar, wind batteries and other clean technologies in the near term.
And let me try to squeeze in one more of the questions before we run out of time and before I turn it over to Sanjay to wrap us up. But Iman Ahmadi Naini from Georgia State University, who's an economics PhD, is asking a really good question, I think, about overbuild. So, Neil, you laid out for us that the planning right now is assuming really large and persistent AI-driven electricity demand. But if the boom slows down or efficiency improves, how should utilities and regulators avoid overbuilding generation and transmission assets that could become stranded assets or increase costs really heavily on ratepayers and have those costs pass on? How do we manage for that right now?
Yeah, so this is just going to be a big challenge. So because there's so much uncertainty around this, there's sort of this, there's this risk of overbuilding or underbuilding, right, that you could have, and both of these could have big consequences. Now, I would say that it's, there are ways that we could deploy, excess capacity that we get in still really useful ways, right? And so, this could be even like a policy measure where we know, for example, right now the federal government is vastly underfunding research scientists out there in terms of doing R&D. Right, and if they could giving those scientists more compute power would be an incredibly valuable thing. And so I think there would be ways to redeploy it if we overbuild, but I don't think we can guarantee that we're not going to overbuild on the production side. But the question, of course, is because there's so much uncertainty, there's also a risk of underbuilding if you don't do it.
Any other advice that folks have for utilities and regulators on managing the overbuilding risk?
We can
Yeah, I mean,
have the government pay for overbuild risk, but we won't be able to come back quickly from an underbuild. So you're never going to get it just right, and we should have managed tools to manage that risk under uncertainty. I'd rather be in an overbuild world than an underbuild world.
And you would just shift the cost there, Costa, off of the ratepayer and onto the taxpayer, like do it some way through the government and not direct.
That's largely how we've done the highway system.
Okay. All right. Well, I thank you for your time, everyone. That was such an incredible panel. I'm so grateful that you were willing to spend time with us, to all the audience who's here. Let me turn us over to Sanjay to close us out.
Thank you to our panelists and the audience for such a great discussion. I'm Sanjay Supan, Project Manager for Academic Research at Equitable Growth. Over the last 2 years, I've worked really closely with researchers and policy stakeholders on questions of industrial policy and the clean energy transition and how they can foster shared economic prosperity. But before we close out, I just wanted to share one brief request. A 4-question survey will appear on your screen as you depart. We'd greatly appreciate it if you took 2 minutes of your time to complete it. Today's discussion underscored that the relationship between AI and the energy transition is not only a technological challenge, it's a values challenge. It's a challenge that forces workers, firms, communities, and policymakers to weigh structures of governance and growth. The choices we make now on energy infrastructure, innovation, workforce development, public investment, and regional growth will determine whether the benefits of this economic transformation are broadly shared. And before we quickly wrap, many of the questions that we discussed today are active areas of inquiry. At Equitable Growth, we're always interested in research that can help policymakers better understand the economic implications of major technological and energy transitions. So if you're working on an issue related to today's discussion and you think your work can inform policy, we'd welcome the opportunity to connect. So thanks again for everyone for your participation. Thanks for coming and have a great afternoon.